The water is cool before sunrise, and the limestone rim beneath your hand still holds the night's faint dampness. Above the cenote, the jungle is only beginning to wake, with leaves barely moving and birds still quiet in the dim blue air. Below, the surface lies dark and clear, ringed with hanging roots and vines that disappear into the opening. As you ease into the pool, sound softens almost at once, and the bright world at the edge begins to loosen and drift away. This still water has been gathering here for ages, rain filtering through pale rock, slowly hollowing chambers beneath the Yucatan forest. Near the light, there are small things to notice first: a green trace of algae on stone, a flicker of fish, a few suspended grains turning in place. But just a little deeper, the cenote changes character, becoming less like a pool and more like an entrance. The water grows clearer, cooler, and strangely older, as if it has been resting a very long time below the roots. And as the morning light thins above you, it becomes natural to follow this limestone well downward toward whatever quiet forms have made a life in its depths. The opening above you is still round and familiar, a pale circle framed by leaves, but the stone around your shoulders is already beginning to close. Its walls are not rough in the way dry cliffs are rough. They are softened by water, scalloped into shallow curves, pale grey and cream, as if the rock has been slowly breathed upon for ages. A few roots reach down beside you, thin and dark, searching through the clear column for cracks where moisture lingers. Small fish hold near them for a moment, then slip aside, silver only when they turn. The deeper you drift, the more the cenote gives up its feeling of openness. The shaft narrows just enough to make the light above seem farther away than it should. That change comes quietly, but it is the first clear sign that this is not only a pool in the forest, it is a doorway into stone. Rain made this place, drop by drop, long before the jungle standing over it now had taken root. The Yucatan Peninsula is built from limestone, a pale rock made in ancient seas from shells, corals, and the compacted remains of marine life. Over immense spans of time, rainwater passed through soil, gathered a little acidity from roots and air, and entered the stone. Not with force, not with haste, just enough over centuries and then millennia to dissolve tiny pathways into wider seams, and seams into chambers, and chambers into hidden rivers. What opened beneath the forest was not a single hollow, but a patient network. This cenote is only the place where its roof gave way. That matters now because as you sink below the hanging vines, the shape of the water begins to tell you that the opening is connected to much more below. The walls no longer fall straight. They lean, then curve inward, then disappear into a darker side passage off to your left. The morning light still touches the upper stone, but lower down the colors are fading into one cool range of blue and gray. You could turn back here easily. The surface is visible, the rim is close enough to imagine warm air, damp leaves, and the faint beginning of birdsong above. But the clarity below you is almost impossible to ignore. Instead of growing cloudier, the water becomes clearer, with depth. That is the invitation. So you choose not to rise. You let your body settle a little deeper, following the shaft as it becomes passage, accepting the quiet exchange that follows. At once, the sounds of the waking forest lose their hold completely. No leaf movement reaches you now, no distant call from the trees. There is only the soft interior hush of water and the slow awareness of stone nearby on every side. Because you kept descending, the cenote changes around you. The shaft opens into a chamber broad enough that the walls withdraw again, though not into daylight. Instead, they gather in shadow, appearing as pale ledges and rounded shelves just beyond the reach of the dim upper glow. A fallen block lies on the floor beneath you, broken from the ceiling at some forgotten time, its edges softened by mineral films. Above it, the ceiling rises into darkness where roots no longer reach. The room has the feeling of architecture, though no one built it. Everything here was made by water carrying away what stone could spare. Along the walls, you begin to see patterns that only form in long stillness. Thin ripples in the limestone, gentle fluting. Curved recesses where mineral-rich water once pooled and withdrew. This cave was not always flooded. That becomes clear in the shapes around you. Some of the stone hangs in tapering points from the ceiling, long and pale, as if frozen in the act of dripping. Others rise from the floor to meet them, column by column, still joined in places, separated in others. Stalactites above, stalagmites below. They could only have formed in air when water seeped through dry chambers and left behind a trace of dissolved calcium carbonate each time it fell. So the room you enter now belongs to more than one world. It belongs to the wet present, where fresh water fills the chamber in complete stillness. And it belongs to an older, drier age, when sea levels were lower and these passages stood open beneath the peninsula. During the last ice age, enormous volumes of Earth's water were held in ice far from here. Sea level dropped. Coastlines moved. Caves that are submerged now once stood empty enough for dripstone to grow, year after year, in darkness broken only by the sound of mineral-rich drops. Then the ice melted, the seas rose, and this stone memory was flooded. That old change remains visible all around you, not as drama, but as evidence. A room can remember what filled it before. Once you notice that, the chamber becomes less empty. It is storing time in its walls. A shrimp, nearly colorless, lifts itself from the rock and drifts a short distance before settling again. It is so pale that for a moment it looks like another fragment of limestone. Then its legs move. Near a crack in the wall, a tiny fish hovers, its body washed of brightness, its movements careful and spare. In these cave waters, life does not spend energy freely. There is little here that can be wasted. Near the entrance, algae could grow where sunlight still reached. Small surface fish could feed at the margins. Leaves and bits of forest debris might occasionally fall in from above. But in this chamber, deeper and dimmer, those easy sources are already fading. That changes what can live here. Animals that remain must depend on what drifts inward from the opening, or what seeps through the greater cave system, or what falls from worlds above in smaller and smaller amounts. Sometimes that source came from bats. In many Yucatan cave systems, bat colonies roosted in dry chambers when the passages still held more air, or in upper vaults that remain above the waterline now. Their guano fed insects, microbes, crustaceans, and the long chain of hidden consumers that can survive in darkness if even a small, steady source of nutrients arrives. A cave does not need abundance to become inhabited. It only needs continuity, a little food, a little shelter, enough time for life to change shape around scarcity. That is why the creatures here seem so restrained. The shrimp on the wall barely moves. The fish in the crack holds almost perfectly still. Even the drifting particles around you are slow enough to make time feel stretched. Your eye begins to adjust, and with that adjustment comes another discovery. The chamber is not sealed. At its far side, where the wall appears to break and bend, there is an opening lower than the one you came through. Not large, not dramatic, just a darker throat in the limestone where the floor slopes away and the water seems to gather itself into a more complete blackness. The opening matters because the water near it is colder, only slightly, but enough to feel on your skin as a gentle difference. That coolness suggests depth beyond sight, and water moving from a place more insulated from the surface day. It is another invitation, but also a decision. You can remain here, in the last chamber where the entrance still lends a little shape to the room, or you can follow the colder water and accept that the world above will become less and less recoverable as a presence in your mind. You choose the darker opening. Not quickly, there is no need. You simply angle yourself toward the sloping floor and let the chamber recede behind you. As a consequence, the last greenish tint of daylight fades almost completely. The water ahead is still clear, but the eye now works differently, reading pale stone by contrast instead of color. The The passage narrows around a bend. Its ceiling dips. The walls come close enough in places that you can see delicate shelves of mineral deposit, cream over grey, grey over tan, laid down by waters that change their chemistry over very long spans. The Yucatan is often described as a place without many rivers on its surface. That is because the water here prefers the underground. Rain falls onto porous limestone, enters quickly, and moves through hidden channels rather than gathering in broad, visible streams. Beneath the forest, I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request. There is an entire hidden drainage moving in the dark, slow as thought, carrying dissolved stone, coolness, and memory through the peninsula. You feel that truth first, as a change in the water against your arms. It is not a current you could call strong. It is more like a direction, a patient leaning, as if the cave itself is guiding water from one chamber to another. The passage ahead is low and smooth, worn by ages of contact between rock and fresh groundwater. Its floor dips gently, its ceiling bears old mineral points, softened now beneath the flood. The deeper you go, the less this place resembles a room. It becomes a route. That difference matters. A chamber can feel still and separate. A route suggests connection, and connection means that what lives here has been shaped not only by this one cenote, but by a whole buried landscape extending under forest, scrub, wetland, and distant coast. Your movement remains slow. There is no hurry, and in a cave like this, speed would only stir what has rested undisturbed. So you drift close to the wall, where the limestone curves in pale arcs like frozen waves. On that stone are thin films of life. At first, they look like stains, no more than a faint smoky coating where the rock darkens slightly. Then your eye learns to read them. Some are microbial mats, built by tiny organisms living in a world with almost no sunlight at all. Some are just a sheen of minerals left behind by changing water chemistry. And some are both at once, life and stone cooperating over long spans, each altering the other by a small amount. A cave often teaches you that boundaries are softer than they seem. Rock is not fixed in the simple way it appears from above. Water is not empty. Even silence is made of many quiet processes continuing together. The opening behind you has faded into a distant memory of brightness. Now the light comes mostly from what little reaches down through clear water and pale stone, reduced to a dim wash that scarcely touches the passage ahead. Everything farther on is red in gradients, grey into blue, blue into charcoal. Charcoal into a darkness that seems less like colour and more like distance. In that dimness, another small creature reveals itself. It clings to the underside of a ledge near your shoulder, almost perfectly matched to the limestone. Its body is segmented and pale, an isopod, one of the quiet scavengers of subterranean water. It does not flee. It only adjusts itself by a fraction, legs feeling the rock, patient as something that has never known wind. Animals in caves often lose the traits that surface life depends upon. Color fades when color no longer matters. Eyes may shrink or stop working altogether when day never arrives. Other senses become more useful. Touch, chemical cues in the water, fine vibrations passing through stone. Energy is precious here, so bodies become efficient, movements restrained, lives measured in careful exchanges rather than abundance. That is why the life around you feels so composed. Nothing wastes itself. Nothing performs. Everything is narrowed toward persistence. The wall bends, and the passage opens into another stone room, longer than the last and lower overhead. A shelf of broken limestone lies along one side, blocks collapsed from an ancient fracture line. Between them are small pockets where silt has collected in soft drifts. The silt is so fine that it resembles ash. One careless motion could lift it into the water and turn clarity into cloud. So you stay high and still, and let your body float above the floor without touching. In the shelter of those fallen blocks, a fish hovers. It is longer than the first one you saw, and even paler, its body almost translucent along the edges. Its eyes are reduced, not absent but small, as though vision here has become an afterthought. It turns slowly in place, not startled, only aware. Many cave fish in the Yucatan are not ancient monsters from a separate world, but descendants of surface species that entered subterranean water long ago and changed, generation by generation, under the rules of darkness. If a population remains isolated long enough, the cave begins to shape it. Traits useful in sunlit streams become less important. Other traits, subtle ones, are favored instead. A body that needs less food, a sense of dissolved chemicals in the water, a behavior that conserves energy. Over time, the descendants become creatures of hidden water, belonging to passages like this one more completely than any riverbank pool. That kind of change takes patience beyond ordinary human scales. Not a season, not a century, longer. And because the Yucatan is riddled with separate yet connected flooded caves, some populations remain linked by narrow routes, while others become isolated in pockets of darkness divided by stone. The result is a quiet variety. Different chambers may hold different forms of shrimp, fish, microbes, and tiny crustaceans, each adapted to its own small conditions. A little more oxygen, a little less food, a little more mineral content. A ceiling open to bats, a tunnel sealed from the surface for ages. In a place built of repeated differences, evolution can happen in many small rooms at once. You drift onward, and the ceiling lifts just enough to vanish into shadow. For a moment, the chamber seems almost cathedral-like, though that word feels too grand and too human. This room was not made for awe. It was made by seepage, dissolution, collapse, and time. Still, there is a dignity in the scale of it. Long stone points hang overhead. Some have merged into curtains, thin mineral draperies with folded edges. Others end in blunt tips where floodwater has softened what once grew in dry air. Each one is proof of an older cave. Before this chamber filled, rainwater carrying dissolved calcium carbonate dripped from the ceiling into empty space. A tiny amount of mineral remained with each drop. Over thousands of years, that residue built downward into stalactites. Below them, where drops struck the floor, stalagmites rose. Given enough time, some met in the middle and formed columns. Only later did rising groundwater and changing sea level reclaim the room. So every flooded chamber contains a memory from before the flood. You are moving through two climates layered together, the living freshwater present and the dry cave past. That past was shaped by lower seas. During the coldest parts of the last ice age, so much water was locked into great continental ice sheets that global sea level stood much lower than it does now. The Yucatan coastline stretched farther outward. Passages that are drowned today stood dry or partly dry beneath the land. Air filled these rooms. Bats could reach them. Mineral formations grew. Sediments settled in a different way. Then the world warmed. Ice melted far away. The ocean slowly advanced, and through porous limestone, marine influence moved inland beneath the peninsula, changing the chemistry of these hidden waters. The cave did not suddenly become something else. It changed by degrees. Dripstone stopped growing where water covered it. Freshwater pathways shifted. Marine water entered lower spaces. Surface openings like cenotes connected the flooded underground to the forest above. A whole subterranean map was redrawn. That is why the cenote never really belongs to one moment. It is an archive of moving boundaries. Air and water. Fresh and salt. Dry age and flooded age. Forest above and aquifer below. Even the nutrients that sustain life here arrive by several routes. Some fall directly from the opening in the form of leaves, dust, pollen, and bits of organic matter. Some are carried in by groundwater after rain. Some seep from soils above, through cracks and pores in the limestone, and in certain cave sections, especially where dry ledges remain, bats and other roosting animals add another source. Their droppings, rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, can feed microbial communities and tiny invertebrates, which then support larger cave dwellers in a chain so spare and efficient that almost nothing is lost. Where there is continuity, a food web can arise from surprisingly little. You notice a faint brown band along part of the wall, just above a shelf of old stone. It is not recent mud, it is a mineral and organic trace, left from a former water level or from a period when seepage carried a slightly different burden through the rock. Caves are full of such lines. They look modest, but they are records. A stain can mark a season repeated for centuries. A crust can show where water paused. A thin layer of calcite can tell you that a chamber once breathed air. Because nothing here is hurried, evidence lasts. A cave can keep small memories for a very long time. The chamber narrows again at its far end. There, the water darkens in a way that is not only about light. Something in it seems to waver. At first, you think the cave floor is shifting. Then the wall above it appears to ripple and blur, though the stone itself remains fixed. As you drift closer, the distortion becomes unmistakable. A horizontal layer crosses the passage like a wavering pane of invisible glass. Above it, the water is one thing, below it another. This is the first clear sign of the Halocline. The word sounds technical, but the experience is simple. Two waters of different salinity meet and resist immediate mixing. Lighter freshwater, delivered by rain and moving through the limestone from inland, tends to rest above. Denser, saltier water, connected in the long underground sense to the distant sea, occupies lower levels. Where they touch, the boundary is not a hard line. It is a transition zone, a trembling interface. If undisturbed, it can appear almost smooth. If brushed by movement, it billows into shimmering folds. The effect is strangely beautiful. The wall behind it looks as though seen through heat above a desert road, or through clear oil on water. Shapes bend, edges double. The cave seems to dream itself out of focus. In the Yucatan, this meeting of waters happens because the limestone is so permeable. Rain falls inland and sinks quickly underground, gathering into a freshwater lens within the porous rock. Closer to the coast, and below deeper parts of the aquifer, marine water presses inward. The two do not remain entirely separate, but their different densities and chemistries create layered conditions in many flooded cave systems. A cenote can therefore hold not one kind of water, but several, stacked, mingling, adjusting, and moving very slowly through subterranean space. The implications for life are profound. A freshwater shrimp cannot simply drift deep into a saline layer without consequence. A fish adapted to one chemistry may avoid another. Microbes may flourish exactly where dissolved oxygen drops, or where sulfur compounds are available, or where salinity changes across only a small vertical distance. An invisible boundary can become an ecological frontier. You hover above the wavering line and wait. There is no sound from it, no sign of threat, only a change in the way the cave is organized. This is the threshold where the cenote stops feeling like a vertical pool with side chambers and begins to feel like part of an inland sea hidden in stone. The water below has its own gravity of presence. Even before passing through it, you sense that things will be different on the other side. The fresh world above, with its last indirect relationship to rainfall and roots, and the morning opening overhead, still belongs to the land. Below, the connection broadens. The coast enters the story. Ancient sea levels return. The drowned cave remembers being nearer the ocean than the forest would ever suggest. You lower yourself toward the boundary. Immediately, the Halocline reacts. Your motion sends a slow curl through it, and the clear division becomes a pale distortion. For a few moments, the water around your face turns milk glass hazy. The wall vanishes into blur. Your own hands appear doubled and bent, as though seen through layers of moving crystal. This brief disorientation is one of the most distinctive experiences in a cenote. The water is still clear in itself, yet the shift in density and salinity bends light and confuses vision. A diver passing through often describes it as entering liquid air, or fog underwater. but the effect settles again almost as quickly as it forms. You remain calm and continue downward. As a consequence, the upper chamber is no longer quite recoverable in the same way. Not because it has become inaccessible, but because this crossing changes your sense of what the cenote is. You cannot go back to thinking of it as a simple jungle well. Now it is a layered aquifer, a drowned karst system, a freshwater roof over a deeper marine influence, an archive where chemistry itself has shape. Below the Halocline, the water steadies, the blur falls away behind you. The walls return, dim and firm, and the cave feels older. Not truly older in years, perhaps, but older in mood because the lower water is more insulated from daily weather above. Temperature shifts are smaller here. Light is weaker. The surface world reaches this depth only after translation through rock and time. The passage opens into a broad, low space where the floor drops away farther than before. It is not a cliff, just a slope into deeper dimness. The stone formations here are more dramatic in one quiet sense. Stalactites hang fully submerged, intact from the age when this room was dry. Some are long and needle-like. Others are thick and fluted, banded with mineral growth laid down one drop at a time. A massive column rises from the floor nearby, its sides smooth where ancient dripstone merged into a single pale trunk. This is a fossil chamber, not because life is absent, but because the architecture belongs to another environmental chapter. Everything around you says that this room once held air. That realization can feel almost intimate. To float among submerged stalactites is to witness a timeline made visible. The stone did not form underwater. It formed in emptiness. Each mineral point overhead was assembled by gravity, evaporation, chemistry, and repetition in a chamber once dry enough to echo. Later, sea level rose after the Ice Age, and groundwater responded. The lower passages flooded first, then more, until rooms like this one became submerged galleries, preserving their dripstone as drowned evidence of the world before the flood. In some caves, even delicate features survive beneath the water because there is so little disturbance. No waves, no strong river pulses, only stillness, chemistry, and occasional sediment settling from above. That is why the deep Yucatan cenotes can seem almost impossibly intact. They are protected by the same isolation that makes life here sparse. A root descends from the ceiling in the distance, long since mineral coated. It no longer looks alive. It looks like a rope turned to stone. Perhaps it once belonged to a tree above when the water level or surface opening was different. Perhaps it reached down in search of moisture and became sheathed in calcite over the years. In caves, even living things may leave behind geological traces. A leaf can become a stain, a root can become a mineral sculpture, a bone can rest in silt until it takes on the color of the chamber around it. You come upon a ledge where pale fragments lie in a shallow depression. They are not fresh, not bright, only shapes among sediment, softened by time. Cave systems in the Yucatan have preserved bones from animals and, in some chambers, from very ancient human passage as well, because cenotes were openings into the groundwater world for thousands of years. But here, in this still room, the important feeling is not of history as event. It is of history as rest. Things entered, then they stayed. Water covered them. Time passed without disturbance. The cave kept them. That is one of the great powers of subterranean places. They receive what falls in, and if movement is low enough, they hold it almost tenderly. You continue along the slope, and visible animals become fewer. The occasional shrimp remains. A tiny crustacean jerks from one patch of stone to another, but the room is now dominated more by mineral surfaces than by moving bodies. This is not a sign of emptiness. It is a sign that the ecosystem is changing with depth. Closer to openings, more organic matter arrives. More species can survive. Farther in, nutrient supply drops. Food webs tighten. The larger and more obvious animals become rare, while subtler forms of life gain importance. You begin to look more carefully at the floor. It is covered in fine sediment, interrupted by darker patches and faint cloudy films. At first, these look like stains or stirred dust resting on the bottom. Then you notice their edges. They are not random. Some spread in delicate sheets over the silt, some gather in low mounded forms, some appear as thin veils lying just above the sediment, so translucent that they are visible only when light grazes them. These are microbial communities, living where chemistry offers a narrow advantage. Down here, sunlight no longer feeds the base of the ecosystem. Instead, some microorganisms rely on compounds dissolved in the water or released from sediment. That process is called chemosynthesis. It is less familiar than photosynthesis, but no less real. Where plants and algae use light to build energy-rich molecules, chemosynthetic microbes use chemical reactions, often involving sulfur, methane, iron, or other reduced compounds, depending on the environment. In a cenote basin, conditions can vary over very small distances. A layer of low oxygen may sit near the sediment. Minerals may seep from the rock. Organic matter falling from above may break down slowly and alter local chemistry. Those small differences create niches, and in those niches, bacteria and archaea can form mats, films, and invisible communities that quietly sustain a deeper level of cave life. You drift lower, careful not to disturb the floor. The sediment below is soft, powder-fine, built from particles settling over long periods. Some came from eroded limestone, some from organic material broken down into fragments too small to recognize. Some from mineral precipitates formed in the water itself. A cenote bottom is not like a riverbed of pebbles and moving grains. It is more like an archive of slow fall. Dust of stone, dust of life, dust of time. A pale thread rises from the floor nearby and sways almost imperceptibly. It is not a worm, though at first it seems like one. It is a thin string of microbial growth, attached to a patch where chemistry differs from the water around it. Not all such growth is dramatic. Much of it is nearly invisible, no more than a ghostly texture on the sediment surface. Yet, these communities matter. They process nutrients. They influence oxygen levels. They alter the way minerals precipitate or dissolve. They can even shape what color the floor appears beneath your drifting light. To the eye, the cenote may seem mostly stone and water. To chemistry, it is alive with exchange. The tunnel bends again, and the ceiling drops low enough to frame the deeper basin ahead. There, the Halocline has left a subtle signature on the room. The upper wall carries lighter mineral coatings, lower surfaces are darker, marked by different films, and a longer relationship with saline or mixed waters. A cave wall can become a map of invisible layering, and because the transitions are slow, the map is not abrupt. It is composed of bands, gradients, and patient changes in texture. You pass beside another submerged stalagmite, broken at the top. Its fracture is old. Perhaps it snapped when part of the chamber roof shifted. Perhaps it was damaged long before the flood, then left where it fell. Now the broken piece lies half buried in sediment like a fallen branch in snow. Nothing rushes to erase it. In surface landscapes, weather is quick. Wind moves sand, rain cuts channels. Plants grow over stone. Here, alteration happens with much smaller gestures. A little mineral crust, a slight settling, a film of microbes. That difference in pace is why submerged cave spaces can feel so dreamlike. They preserve forms that would vanish elsewhere. You pause near the floor and look across the basin. The room is wide enough now that its far wall recedes into darkness. Between you and that wall, tiny particles drift downward through the beam of your awareness. They fall so slowly that they seem suspended. Those slow falling grains are part of the story here, because what reaches this basin does so only after a very long journey. A flake of limestone may begin high above, loosened by rainwater in the forest soil, then carried into a crack too small to see. A bit of plant matter may drift in through the cenote opening, sink through the clear column, and settle only when every small current has given up. Even the smallest arrival matters in a place where input is sparse. Over years, then centuries, then longer spans that no one in the forest above could feel, the floor becomes a record of patience. You let yourself settle a little closer, not touching the bottom, only drifting near enough to see the difference between bare sediment and living film. The living parts do not announce themselves. They are pale grey here, faint cream there, and in one low patch they carry a slight cloudy blue that seems visible only from the corner of your eye. If you stirred the basin, much of that subtle order would disappear into a soft plume. But undisturbed, each patch keeps its shape. That shape is evidence. It tells you that the chemistry near the floor is not the same as the water a little higher up. Down here, oxygen can be lower. Organic particles that sink from above may break down slowly and change the immediate conditions around the sediment. Minerals dissolved from the limestone, or brought in through deeper flow routes, can accumulate in narrow zones. And where conditions differ even slightly, microbes gather according to what they can use. Some consume sulfur compounds, some make a living from reactions so small and steady that they have no visible motion at all. Yet their stillness is not inactivity. It is simply a different scale of work. A bacterial mat may appear like a stain, but it is also a community. Each layer may hold organisms adapted to a slightly different amount of oxygen, salinity, or dissolved chemical energy. The upper film might meet the water, the lower layers might work at the edge of the sediment. Together they form a kind of garden made not by sunlight, but by exchange. That is one of the deep lessons of a cenote basin. Life does not vanish when light does. It changes its method. On the floor ahead, one of the cloudy patches has a soft raised edge, as though the sediment were breathing under a veil. It is only an illusion of form, created by thickness and contrast. Still, the impression is gentle and unmistakable. The basin is not empty. It is inhabited at a scale the surface world rarely asks you to notice. You drift along the slope, and the floor begins to level out. The room broadens. The ceiling, dim above, almost disappears. What defines the space now is not the architecture of hanging stone, but the relationship between sediment, water, and the merely invisible life spread across both. A small crustacean moves through that landscape, no larger than a fingernail, almost transparent except for a faint inner line. It crosses a patch of bare silt, pauses at the edge of a microbial film, and remains there as if reading chemistry with its body. That pause is another clue. In caves, many animals do not find their world by looking. They find it through touch, dissolved cues, and vibration. A boundary on the floor may matter as much to them as a cliff face matters above ground. The deep basin rewards this way of thinking. Here, a few centimeters can separate richer oxygen from poorer oxygen, softer sediment from firmer mineral crust, one microbial community from another. The entire landscape becomes fine-grained. You begin to understand why larger visible animals are so few. The energy available here is limited. Food webs narrow as they descend away from openings, away from falling leaves, away from roosting bats, away from anything that arrives in quantity. So the ecosystem leans more heavily on microbes, on decomposition, on chemical opportunities that would be considered minor elsewhere. What is minor above can be foundational below. A faint line in the sediment curves away to your right. At first it seems like a random groove. Then you see another, and another, each one slight but deliberate. Something small has passed over this floor before. Perhaps a shrimp, perhaps an isopod, perhaps another cave-dwelling scavenger moving from patch to patch in darkness. The marks endure because the basin is so quiet. On a river bottom they would vanish in minutes. Here they may remain until the next settling of fine particles covers them over. That is the nature of still places. They keep delicate evidence. The water around you feels almost motionless, but not entirely. There is always some hidden exchange in a cenote system, some patient movement through stone, some density-driven shifting between chambers, some response to rain far away, or to the distant sea pressing softly through porous limestone. You cannot see that movement clearly in the basin itself. You sense it through gradients, a coolness, a slight difference in clarity over one patch of floor, a thin veil leaning in one direction rather than another. The hidden network continues to breathe through the rock, even when the basin seems asleep. That broader connection matters because these microbial communities are not isolated from the rest of the peninsula. Their conditions are shaped by water that may have traveled beneath forest, beneath scrubland, beneath old limestone ridges, perhaps even beneath wetlands, where roots and soils changed its chemistry before it ever reached this chamber. A drop entering the ground miles away may, in time, influence this floor. That is how connected karst works. The porous stone does not divide the landscape so neatly as dry land suggests. Instead, it joins distant places underground. This cenote is one opening into that buried continuity. You look again at the soft mounded patches. In some deep cave systems, similar mats have been found where sulfur-rich and oxygen-poor conditions meet, supporting bacteria that can live from chemical disequilibrium rather than light. The Yucatan cenotes vary from one basin to another, and not every chamber carries the same chemistry. Some are clearer, simpler, more oxygen-rich. Others hold stronger gradients. But the principle remains. Where water layers, stagnates, seeps, and exchanges slowly, microbial life finds niches, and niches, over time, become landscapes. There is something almost tender in the way these films occupy the floor. They do not spread like surface plants in a race for sunlight. They accumulate. They persist. They alter the sediment by increments too small to notice in a single visit. Yet given enough time, they may influence how minerals precipitate, how organic matter is broken down, even how the color and texture of the basin are perceived. Life here is subtle enough to be mistaken for geology. Geology here is active enough to guide life. The distinction softens. A pale mineral crust along the basin margin may provide firmer ground for certain microbes. A decaying leaf fragment carried in long ago may create a tiny island of different chemistry. A small depression may trap finer organic particles and become more biologically active than the flat floor beside it. Each detail creates consequence. Each consequence, repeated often enough, becomes pattern. This is why the deep cenote does not remain interesting only because of its large shapes, its shafts and chambers and flooded stalactites. At depth, interest moves inward. It becomes more patient. You stop looking for obvious movement and begin to notice process. The basin changes your attention. That change in attention is part of the descent. Near one low rise in the floor, the sediment darkens to a soft grey-brown. The patch is irregular, but not chaotic. Its edge feathers into the paler silt around it. A little above the surface, the water there seems almost thicker, though that thickness is only a visual suggestion caused by suspended fine material and a different texture beneath. This may be a place where organic matter accumulates slightly more than elsewhere, or a place where reduced compounds seep upward from the sediment and support a different microbial consortium. In cave science, these slight variations become important clues. They reveal where oxygen is being consumed, where nutrients gather, where groundwater chemistry changes from one microenvironment to the next. Nothing in a cenote basin is random for long. Even apparent disorder settles into arrangement when the system is quiet enough. A translucent shrimp appears again near the edge of the darker patch. Its antennae move slowly forward, its body barely advances. Then it picks its way across the sediment as if every step must be considered. That restraint is familiar now. The animals of this cave are shaped by scarcity, and scarcity favors conservation. Fast lives belong elsewhere. Down here, the successful creature is often the one that wastes least. This includes behavior, long pauses, short movements, sensitivity to faint signals, energy saved wherever possible. You can feel the logic of that in your own stillness. To move gently here is not only respectful, it is appropriate to the place itself. The cenote is teaching the body how to belong to slow water. The thought of early Earth enters naturally in a basin like this, not because the cenote is a perfect mirror of that distant world, but because chemosynthetic microbial communities show how life can flourish without direct sunlight, using chemical gradients instead. Long before forests leaned over cenote rims, long before birds woke in blue dawn above the jungle, Earth held microbial worlds shaped by stone, water, and chemical energy. Some modern cave systems preserve echoes of those possibilities. They are not fossils of the ancient planet, they are living analogues, reminders that biology does not always begin with brightness. Sometimes it begins with contrast, one chemical meeting another, one layer touching the next, one environment offering a narrow but persistent opportunity. That is enough. A basin like this can therefore feel both very local and strangely planetary. It belongs to the Yucatan, to dissolved limestone, to the peninsula's aquifer, to the rise and fall of sea level after the last ice age. And yet it also suggests something broader, that life is patient, that life takes hold in margins. That darkness is not the same as absence. The floor ahead slopes very gently into a shallow trough. The trough holds finer sediment than the surrounding basin and fewer visible mats. Perhaps this is a slight route of water movement, just enough to discourage the softest growth. Or perhaps heavier particles settle differently here. In a submerged cave, shape and chemistry are always in conversation. A change in contour affects settling. Settling affects organic accumulation. Accumulation affects microbial life. Microbial activity changes chemistry. Chemistry over time alters minerals, round and round, in quiet cycles. You follow the trough because it offers the next clue. As you drift above it, the far wall of the chamber comes slowly into view, not all at once but in pale fragments. A ledge, a downward crack, a mound of breakdown blocks partly buried in silt. The wall is not smooth. It bears the marks of old dissolution when the chamber was dry or partly air-filled, then later the softer overprint of floodwater occupying the space for thousands of years. Some surfaces are scalloped. Some are draped with calcite. Some have a dull coating from long mineral contact with layered waters. Each texture belongs to a chapter in the cave's history. You are moving through those chapters at once. That overlapping time is one reason cenotes feel more complex than ordinary pools. They are not only vertical openings, they are intersections of eras. The collapse that opened the shaft to the jungle was one event. The dissolution that created the cave network happened across much longer spans. The dry period when stalactites formed belongs to a lower sea level world. The flooding of the chambers belongs to post-glacial change. The present-day layering of fresh and marine-influenced water belongs to the aquifer now. And the microbial films on the basin floor belong to this morning, if morning can still be said to matter here at depth. All those times coexist in the same room. The wall ahead narrows into a lower passage. It is not dramatic, it simply gathers the basin into a direction. This is how many cave routes announce themselves, by a subtle organization of space rather than a grand opening. The floor rises slightly along one side. The sediment thins. The stone begins to dominate again. That shift tells you that fewer settling particles remain in this route, or that water movement is enough to prevent soft accumulation. The passage is another reminder that the basin is not the end of the system. It is a pause within it. You angle toward the narrowing, and as you do, the quiet ecosystem behind you rearranges itself in memory. What first looked like emptiness now feels inhabited. What first looked like a floor now feels like a living plain. That is the consequence of staying long enough. The eye learns. The mind adjusts. The cave becomes more crowded with significance, even as visible life grows sparse. Near the entrance to the passage, a thin white line curves across the rock. It might be a mineral seam, but as you come closer, it resolves into a soft filamentous growth, almost cotton-like, anchored where seepage from the wall introduces slightly different chemistry. These microbial threads are delicate. They rely on stability. A stronger current would tear them away, a busier cave would bury them. But here they remain, faint as breath on glass. Such growths can mark the places where water emerging from tiny pores meets the larger flooded chamber. Groundwater need not roar to matter. It can arrive invisibly, molecule by molecule, and still create a usable boundary for life. This is how karst landscapes conduct themselves. Most of the action is hidden. The Yucatan above can seem level, almost quiet in its topography, but below it lies a porous archive of seepage, dissolution, collapse, and subterranean flow. Rain does not simply vanish into the ground. It enters a system of storage and transit. Cenotes reveal that system where the roof has opened, but the real body of water extends far beyond the visible shaft. The more deeply you descend, the more that becomes unavoidable. One cenote leads to chambers. Chambers lead to passages. Passages merge with other passages, some broad, some constricted, some ending in collapse, some continuing for astonishing distances. Together they form what is best understood as a buried landscape. Not a single cave, but a network. Not a pool, but part of a groundwater world. The passage ahead trends away from the basin with a slight downward lean, then levels. The water feels marginally different here, a touch cooler, a touch more mineral on the tongue of your awareness. Perhaps this route draws from deeper saline influence. Perhaps it simply sees less recent exchange with the surface. In any case, the difference is enough to remind you that underground water is not uniform. Even within one connected system, layers and roots produce local character. The walls are close again now, and with the floor more firm beneath you, the soundless intimacy of limestone returns. This closeness changes the scale of observation. Back in the basin, your attention widened. Here, it narrows. You notice shallow pockets in the stone, each holding a faint dusting of settled material. You notice tiny crystalline glints where calcite catches the dimmest available light. You notice an old fracture line running across the ceiling, its edges softened but still visible, perhaps a weakness that widened over ages, until another chamber somewhere else collapsed and became the cenote opening above. Collapse is part of cenote formation. The caves begin as dissolved voids in limestone. As those voids grow, some ceilings become too thin to support the weight above. Eventually, a roof section fails. The sky enters. Roots follow. Light finds a path down. What was once only hidden becomes a well in the forest. But the opening is just the latest event. The deeper routes existed before it, and continue beyond it. That is why a cenote can feel both intimate and immense. Its rim is small, its system is not. A pale fish rests beneath a projecting shelf in the passage wall. It does not swim away. Its body is almost the same color as the limestone, and its fins make only the smallest corrections. Whether it is sleeping, conserving energy, or simply holding in place is hard to know. In caves, behavior often blurs into stillness. The usual surface categories become less useful. What matters is that the animal is fitted to this subdued world, reduced pigment, reduced reliance on sight, a metabolism tuned to low input, life that has accepted dimness not as deprivation, but as the ordinary condition of being. There is comfort in that, not because the cave is easy, but because it is coherent. Everything here belongs to the same slow logic. The passage begins to widen again, though this time not into a large chamber. Instead, it opens into a long tunnel with a floor of stone and intermittent sediment pockets. The ceiling arches low and even, as though water once traveled through it as a more active conduit. Perhaps it did, during an earlier hydrological phase when sea level, rainfall patterns, or groundwater gradients differed from today. Cave systems are dynamic over geological time. A route important in one age may become marginal in another. Flooding can preserve older forms, while new water paths develop elsewhere. The tunnel therefore carries a double meaning. It is a corridor now, and a relic of former circulation. As you continue, The sense of the whole peninsula presses in more gently than before. At first, the cenote felt local, a shaft in the jungle, a room beneath roots. Then it became a cave. Then a layered cave. Then a drowned archive. Now, in this long connecting tunnel, it becomes unmistakably regional. The water around you belongs not only to this opening, but to a system stretching beneath broad reaches of Yucatan limestone. That system links inland rain to coastal emergence. It links forest soils to cave chemistry. It links separate cenotes to one another through routes no surface trail could reveal. This is the hidden circulatory pattern of the peninsula. Not a river in the surface sense, but a distributed flow through soluble rock. In some areas, the passages are wide enough for long travel. In others, water moves through fractures and pores too narrow for anything larger than a dissolved mineral to pass. Together, these routes store fresh water, exchange salts, buffer seasonal shifts, and create habitats of astonishing isolation and connection at once. A species may live in one branch of the system and nowhere else on Earth. Another may disperse through linked waters farther than anyone would guess from looking at the forest above. Geography underground is not always intuitive. A short distance at the surface may be a stone barrier below. A far-off wetland may be chemically closer to this chamber than a neighboring depression. That is why cave biologists and hydrologists read cenotes carefully. They are windows into processes otherwise concealed. The tunnel floor dips through a shallow notch, and there the sediment has gathered again in a long, narrow stripe. Its surface is smoother than the basin floor was, less visibly inhabited, but not lifeless. At the edge of the stripe, a tiny white amphipod-like creature jerks forward, then stops. Its movement is abrupt only in shape, not in spirit. Even its darting seems muted by the cave. It disappears into a crack no wider than a finger. For small crustaceans, such cracks are whole neighborhoods. They shelter from larger scavengers. They hold different water conditions. They collect organic films and bacterial growth. In a cave, scale changes everything. An opening that your eye nearly ignores may be the center of an animal's range. A narrow fissure can isolate populations for long periods, encouraging subtle divergence. This is part of why subterranean biodiversity can be both rich and fragile. Rich because isolation creates opportunity for specialization. Fragile because each niche depends on continuity of water quality, of flow regime, of nutrient input, of the surrounding aquifer remaining intact. The cenote itself does not tell you this as a warning. It tells you as a fact. Its life is inseparable from its geology. Change the water, and the cave changes. Change the cave, and the life rearranges. Everything here is linked by slow cause and effect. Along the right wall, mineral bands appear again, this time more distinct. A pale horizontal stripe runs beneath a darker one, both interrupted by dripstone forms submerged long ago. Those bands are quiet markers of changing water, and they show that this tunnel has not always held the same mixture. A little more fresh water at one time, a little more marine influence at another, a longer pause in seepage. A period of better ventilation when the chamber was dry, then the flood again, and the long patient settling that followed. When stone keeps records like this, you begin to understand the cave less as a place and more as a sequence. Each layer, each stain, each mineral edge says that the water beneath the peninsula has always been adjusting. Not rapidly, not violently. Just enough, over and over, to leave a memory. You move beside the wall and let your attention follow those memories. A curtain of calcite hangs from the ceiling ahead, thin and folded, like draped fabric turned to pale stone. Its lower edge has been rounded by submergence, but the folds remain. That means the water that later filled this tunnel rose gently enough and stayed gentle enough to preserve details that would never survive a rougher world. The same stillness that protects the rock also shapes the life. Nothing here is built for turbulence. Everything is built for continuity. The tunnel broadens by degrees. And with that change comes another faint sign that the system is carrying water from elsewhere. The floor is firmer now, less powdery. Here and there, narrow runnels in the sediment point in a common direction. They are so slight that you might miss them if you were hurrying, but they suggest slow movement through this passage, enough to sort particles and leave a preferred path behind. In the Yucatan aquifer, water rarely announces itself with visible force. More often, it reveals itself by arrangement: a little ridge on one side of a floor pocket, a veil of microbial growth leaning one way, a difference in temperature where two routes meet. That is how a buried landscape speaks. You follow the shallow runnels because they offer the simplest story the tunnel can tell. They point away from the basin and toward a larger connection below the forest. The walls begin to bear more small holes, rounded and uneven, where solution once bit into softer portions of the limestone. Some are empty, some hold settled silt. A few contain tiny crustaceans so pale they seem almost made of water. They wait in those pockets with the same economy you have seen everywhere in the cave. No wasted motion, no sudden departures, only a long readiness, as if life here has learned to trust that the world will remain still long enough for patience to be useful. That trust is not sentimental, it is environmental. A cave passage like this changes so slowly that slowness itself becomes a reasonable strategy. If food arrives in tiny amounts, wait. If chemical cues are faint, feel carefully. If a neighboring fissure may hold a little more oxygen or a little more microbial film, move only when it matters. The tunnel teaches these habits to everything inside it. Even your own thoughts seem to space themselves farther apart here. Ahead, the ceiling lifts again, and the floor begins a gradual descent through another low opening. This opening is wider than the last basin entrance, but flatter, as though the cave has been pressed into a long horizontal seam. The rock at its lip is polished by old contact with moving water, not strong flow, just enough for long enough to smooth the limestone into a muted shine. A passage like this can connect worlds within the same cave system that behave very differently. One chamber may receive more fresh infiltration after rain. Another may sit closer to the slow inland reach of saline groundwater. A third may be influenced by both, in shifting balance, depending on season, drought, or distant pressure from the coast. Because the Yucatan is built from porous carbonate rock, water is always negotiating those relationships underground. The surface may look dry and separate. Below, the chemistry is in conversation. You ease through the lower opening, and the tunnel beyond feels more insulated again. The water seems denser in mood, if not in measurable weight. Light from the cenote opening has long since ceased to matter. What gives shape to the space now is only the pale reflectivity of limestone and the memory your eyes have built from its contours. Here, distance becomes abstract. A wall appears because it catches contrast. A floor exists because particles have settled there. The rest is dark continuity. Along one side, the stone is broken by a deep fracture. Its edges are lined with fine crystalline growth, like sugar dusted over wet clay. Calcite can precipitate in such places where seepage emerges with the right balance of dissolved minerals and where conditions remain stable enough for crystals to enlarge without being scoured away. That matters because it shows that even in a flooded passage, the rock is not passive. Water continues to dissolve it in one place, build it in another, and exchange ions across every subtle boundary. A cave never truly finishes forming. It only changes pace. The fracture narrows below sight, but the water around it feels slightly cooler. That could mean a tiny input from a deeper route. It could mean a connection too small to enter, but large enough to supply water with a different history. This is common in karst systems. The visible tunnel is only the part your eye can follow. Beyond it, countless pores, seams, and cracks continue the movement at scales far smaller. Groundwater does not need generous openings to travel. It only needs pathways. And where pathways persist, chemical influence persists with them. The tunnel floor falls away very gently, and the walls open into a wider corridor. There is no dramatic chamber waiting here. Instead, there is length. A long stone artery extending ahead in a line so steady it feels almost intentional. This is where the cenote becomes easiest to understand as one window into something much larger. The corridors beneath the Yucatan are not arranged for spectacle. They are arranged by hydrology. Water sought weakness in the rock. Weakness widened. Flow adjusted. Sea level rose and fell. Freshwater lenses thickened and thinned. Ceilings remained intact in some reaches and collapsed in others. Over geologic time, the result was not one great neat cavern, but a branching anatomy. Some passages serve as conduits, some as storage, some as isolated basins, some as crossroads where chemistry changes sharply over short distance. What you are following now feels like one of the conduits, a quiet channel through which the wider system makes itself known. There is a slight pull here, not enough to move you, but enough to suggest orientation. If you release thought for a moment and simply feel the water against your skin, it tells you that this corridor is part of an exchange. Somewhere, rain filtered through soil and entered the limestone. Somewhere else, marine water pressed landward through lower reaches of the aquifer. Between those influences, countless subtle movements distribute minerals, dissolved gases, and temperature differences across the hidden network. This corridor is one expression of that distribution. You continue forward, and on the ceiling overhead you notice a line of old bell holes. Rounded upward cups formed where dissolution worked against trapped air in a former dry or partly air-filled stage. Now they are flooded, their shapes only visible because calcite traces and shadow define them. These features are another reminder that the water filling the cave is younger than much of the cave itself. The architecture came first, the flood arrived later. That order matters. It means the cenote depths are not simply underwater space. They are former airspace reclaimed by groundwater and sea influence, while still preserving the language of their earlier condition. A dry cave was written in dripstone. A flooded cave writes in layers. This one contains both scripts at once. Near the floor, a ribbon of darker sediment crosses the passage, then fades. It may have gathered where a slight eddy forms, or where a lower crack exhales enough water to alter how particles settle. Either way, the pattern is too clean to be accidental. You pause and look more carefully. At the edge of the ribbon there are tiny branching tracks, finer than thread, each ending where the sediment softens into shadow. Small invertebrates have crossed here, perhaps many times. Perhaps over seasons. The marks overlap just enough to suggest repetition without crowding. Even in a corridor, the cave floor is used. Life follows routes as water does. Not the same routes always, but routes shaped by chemistry, shelter, and opportunity. A crack in one wall may host more microbial film. A sediment ton may trap more organic particles. A patch of slightly higher oxygen may support a denser scattering of minute prey. For a small crustacean, these differences are as meaningful as a shoreline or meadow. The corridor narrows slightly around a pillar of stone left standing between two dissolved paths. Its surface is banded and smooth, and around its base the sediment is thinner, as though the water has been brushing past it for a long time. You circle it slowly. On the downstream side, if downstream is the right word in such subdued flow, a soft pocket of silt has gathered, and in that pocket rests a pale fish, head angled into the faintest movement. That posture is revealing. Even in near stillness, cave animals can orient to gentle water exchange. A body held toward a current receives information, scented compounds, oxygen gradients, signals from prey or microbial activity. Vision is less useful here than constant chemical reading. The fish remains steady as you drift by. Its stillness is so complete that it might be mistaken for a karst made of bone-white glass. Only its fins, making tiny corrections, show that it is alive in the present moment. Underground isolation often leads surface people to imagine loneliness, but caves do not seem lonely to the organisms that belong to them. They are detailed places, full of boundaries, textures, chemical weather, and reliable patterns. What feels sparse to you may feel richly structured to a shrimp, a blind fish, an isopod, or a bacterial mat. The corridor begins another gradual bend. The right wall drops into a lower slot filled with darker water. The left wall rises in terraces of old dissolution, each shelf edged with a thin mineral lip. A long time ago, when this section was air-filled, dripping water may have splashed and spread across those shelves before evaporating and leaving calcite behind. Later, submergence smoothed the surfaces without destroying them. To look at a cave wall like this is to see time behaving in layers. No single process made it. Dissolution first, then dripstone growth, then flooding, then slow mineral adjustment under layered water, then sediment settling below. Each phase left something for the next. The corridor opens again, and now the floor changes in a way that feels important. The stone gives way to a broad apron of finer deposits, but unlike the deep basin above, this apron is streaked. Long pale lanes alternate with darker ones, all aligned with the passage. That pattern suggests more consistent water exchange here than in the still basin, enough flow to sort particles by weight and settle them in bands, not enough to erase them. This is how the hidden arteries of the peninsula reveal themselves, not by speed, but by organization. A current too weak to be noticed in motion can still shape a floor over years. You move above the banded sediment and feel the corridor become less like a room and more like a transit route for the aquifer itself. The water that rests here may spend a long time in place, but it also belongs to movement larger than this one passage. Fresh water entering inland will not remain exactly where it first descends. It migrates, mixes at boundaries, presses, rises, and is replaced. Deeper marine water shifts too, under the influence of coastal pressure and geological structure. The hidden system is not static. It only wears stillness well. That realization changes the cenote once again. Earlier, the depths seemed archival, then microbial. Now they become circulatory. The cave is not just preserving old conditions, it is participating in present exchange across the peninsula. This matters for the life here. A species confined to one branch depends on the chemistry of that branch remaining within familiar limits. A change in rainfall can alter freshwater recharge. A change at the coast can alter salinity in lower reaches. Because the aquifer is connected, local conditions often reflect distant processes. A chamber deep inland may still feel the long influence of the sea. A tunnel near the coast may still receive signals from storms that passed over forest many miles away. The cave is intimate, but never entirely isolated. A little farther on, the banded sediment rises into low ridges. They resemble dunes, though they are far too subdued for that word in the surface sense. Still, they show that even here, in water that seems almost motionless, particles can be arranged by persistent patterns. The crest of one ridge holds fewer tracks than the sheltered trough behind it. That makes sense. Even a slight difference in exposure can alter where tiny animals pause, feed, or cross. On the sheltered side of the ridge, a faint creamy film has developed. Microbes again. Not in great mats like the deeper basin, but in quiet patches where settling and chemistry favor them. You begin to see the network not as a string of separate habitats, but as a gradient. Open shaft to chamber. Chamber to Twilight passage. Passage to Halocline. Halocline to drowned fossil rooms. Fossil rooms to microbial basin. Basin to corridor. Corridor to artery. Each zone overlaps the next. No sharp border lasts forever. Life and mineral processes sort themselves along those transitions. That is why so many cave species are specialized without being entirely confined. A shrimp may tolerate one range of salinity better than another. A fish may favor the fresher ceiling of a layered room but still cross into mixed water. Microbes may gather precisely where oxygen thins, then vanish a few hand lengths away. The cave is a place of fine partitions, not hard walls. On the left, the corridor receives another joining passage, narrow and low, entering at an angle. Where the waters meet, the sediment on the floor twists into a subtle fan. There is your evidence. Another root, another branch of the buried system feeding this one. Perhaps it comes from a different cenote beyond the forest. Perhaps from a flooded chamber with a higher freshwater influence. Perhaps from a collapsed sinkhole whose opening is hidden beneath vines and leaf litter above. The point is not to map it fully. The point is to feel how one opening has become many. The Yucatan above is scattered with cenotes, wetlands, dry forest, and low limestone ridges. Below, many of those features are hydraulically related through the karst. Water entering in one place may emerge in another after long passage underground. That is why the peninsula can appear to lack surface rivers while holding so much fresh water beneath. The rivers are there. They are simply inside the stone. You drift past the joining tunnel, and the water cools by the slightest degree. That small shift is enough to suggest that the incoming route carried water with a different residence time underground, or a different history of exchange with rock. In hydrogeology, such clues matter. Temperature, dissolved minerals, salinity, and oxygen each trace something about where water has been and how long it has traveled. In the cave, those clues become atmosphere. A route feels old, a chamber feels fresher, a seam in the wall feels active. Science and sensation meet very naturally here. The corridor continues, but now with more side pockets and low alcoves. In one alcove, the ceiling dips almost to the floor, leaving a crescent of water between. Inside that crescent, a cloud-soft deposit lines the base of the wall. It could be fine carbonate mud. It could also contain microbial contribution, because certain communities can influence mineral precipitation by altering local chemistry around them. That possibility is one of the subtle wonders of caves. Life does not merely occupy the space. Sometimes it helps shape the textures within it, not on the scale of a cliff or chamber, of course, but on the scale of films, crusts, surfaces, and sediment stability, yes. Microbes can mediate reactions that encourage minerals to form or dissolve. Over long spans, that becomes visible as a softened edge, a changed color, a thin mineral skin where water conditions favored growth. The alcove gives way to another straight reach. This one feels deeper, though the floor remains visible in pale outline. Perhaps the roof rises, perhaps the walls retreat, perhaps it is simply that the passage ahead is clear enough and uniform enough to suggest more continuation than before. That sensation of hidden distance under stone is one of the gentlest forms of immensity. Not the open immensity of sky or sea surface, a contained immensity, a landscape that expands without brightening. It asks for a different kind of attention, not scanning, listening with the eyes. You continue, the tunnel slowly lowers and rounds. The walls become smoother, more conduit-like, and the floor more stripped of soft sediment. This suggests a route that sees somewhat more regular flow. Again, not strong, just enough to prevent the finest particles from settling permanently. In such corridors, organic matter may be less likely to accumulate in thick deposits, which means large microbial mats are rarer, but thin films on rock and in cracks can still support tiny grazers and scavengers. Everything depends on where energy pauses long enough to be used. A leaf fragment trapped in a crevice, a brown stain of dissolved organics along a seam, a bacterial film where oxygen and reduced compounds overlap. This economy of the small governs the entire hidden ecosystem. A few cave shrimp pass one another near the wall, and even that is understated. One rises a little, the other shifts lower. Neither moves in haste. They seem to negotiate space through gentle avoidance, as if the corridor were wide enough for everyone because time itself is wide enough. That feeling grows stronger the farther you move from the opening. Surface life often organizes itself around day and night, season and bloom, sudden abundance, and sudden loss. Subterranean life is organized more by persistence. A little input, steadily enough. A little shelter. A chemistry stable enough to return to. Even change, when it comes, tends to arrive slowly, through long rainfall patterns, sea level adjustments over ages, or shifts in nutrient supply that spread through the aquifer rather than striking all at once. That is why the cave feels ancient not only in age, but in tempo. The corridor narrows again around a pinch point, where the limestone on both sides bears heavy scalloping. This is solution work, evidence that water once moved through here with enough consistency to carve the wall into nested hollows. Above the pinch point, a broken stalactite stump protrudes from the ceiling. Its tip is blunt and coated with a thin, dark film. Below it, on the floor, lies no matching fragment. If the lower part broke away, it was either carried elsewhere in some earlier hydrological phase, or now lies hidden beneath mineral deposits and sediment. Caves keep partial answers. That is part of their calm. They are under no obligation to explain every remnant they preserve. Past the pinch point, the water appears slightly clearer again. Not because there are fewer particles exactly, but because the passage seems to hold less fine suspended matter than the basin behind. This can happen where movement is just enough to keep the water renewed and reduce the lingering haze of broken sediment. With clearer water, the walls sharpen. Their pale undulations become more readable. A seam of darker rock crosses diagonally overhead, perhaps a bedding plane in the limestone, perhaps a fracture filled and later softened by dissolution. The geologic grain of the peninsula runs through the cave in such features. These passages are not random voids. They follow weaknesses inherited from the rock itself, joints, beds, porous layers, and structural lines that rainwater exploited over time. In that sense, the hidden waterways beneath the Yucatan are collaborations between chemistry and geology. Water dissolved, rock directed, sea level adjusted the base conditions, time did the rest. The corridor ahead receives a faint downward slope, and the water cools once more. Now the feeling is unmistakable. You are moving through a route that is more strongly connected to the deeper body of the aquifer. The signs of that connection are small, but once you notice them, they begin to gather into a clearer pattern. A cooler seam runs close along the floor, and the mineral skin on the walls changes from chalky pale to a faint, tea-dark sheen. That darker coating does not mean the stone is older there. It means the water touching it has carried a slightly different chemistry and has done so for long enough to leave a trace. In porous limestone, chemistry is often the most patient sculptor. It writes in films first, then in crusts, then in the way one surface dulls, while another keeps a soft mineral shine. You follow the cooler water because it offers the simplest kind of direction. Not a current you could name, only a long, subtle leaning through the passage. The floor dips a little more, and the corridor widens into a low chamber, where the ceiling is nearly level from side to side. It feels less like a room made by collapse, and more like a conduit, worn open along a preferred route in the rock. That difference matters. Collapse leaves angular stone and broken geometry. A conduit leaves rounded edges, smoothed bends, and a sense that water once favored this way, again and again, overspans too long to imagine all at once. The walls here are marked by old solution pockets, shallow bowls and grooves, each one polished by years of contact with moving groundwater. Between them are narrow ledges where a little silt has settled. On one such ledge, a pale crustacean rests with its antennae stretched into the water, still as a root tip. Beside it, there is a faint creamy fuzz on the stone. Not sediment, not mineral alone. A microbial growth, feeding where a trickle from the rock meets the surrounding water and creates a narrow band of useful chemistry. This is how the hidden network keeps revealing itself, not through spectacle, but through evidence. A wall stain, a temperature shift, a patch of life arranged exactly where two conditions overlap. You begin to feel the entire peninsula above you in a new way. The forest, the scrub, the low ridges, the wetlands after rain, the distant Caribbean shore, all of it has some quiet relationship to the water here. Rain falling far inland seeps down through soil and into the limestone. It enters fractures, pores, and old dissolution channels. It moves slowly, but it moves. Closer to the coast, seawater presses landward through lower parts of the aquifer, meeting that fresher water beneath the land. The result is not a single underground river, but a layered, connected body of groundwater shaped by pressure, density, rock structure, and time. This chamber is one fold in that larger body. And because you have come this far, the cenote above no longer feels like an isolated opening. It feels like a skylight into a buried landscape. The floor of the conduit becomes firmer as you descend, with fewer soft deposits and more exposed stone. That tells you something too. Where fine sediment cannot settle easily, there is usually just enough exchange to keep the bottom swept clear over long periods. Not clean in the way a surface stream might scour itself clean. Only sorted, only organized. In the hollows, a thin dust remains. On the rises, almost none. A system of invisible preferences has shaped the room. At the base of the right wall, a narrow crack exhales water cold enough to feel as a small change against your skin. The crack is far too tight to enter. It is only a seam in the limestone, a dark vertical line edged with pale calcite, but the water leaving it has clearly spent a long time below. It is steady. It is mineral-rich enough to have crusted the margins, and it carries with it the suggestion of other passages beyond sight, other chambers holding older water in darkness. The visible cave is only a fraction of the aquifer's anatomy. Most of the exchange happens in places too small to see. That truth widens the space around you, even though the chamber itself remains modest. This is often what depth does in karst. It does not always produce grander rooms. Sometimes it produces greater context. The fish and shrimp you have seen along the way are no longer just cave creatures in a single flooded shaft. They are inhabitants of a distributed world, divided by stone, linked by water, each population shaped by small conditions that vary from chamber to chamber. A little more salt here, a little more oxygen there, a little more organic matter after rain in a connected cenote many miles away. Over long spans, those slight differences become evolutionary pressure. A species confined to one branch of the network may drift, slowly, into a form more specialized than its relatives elsewhere. Another may remain broadly tolerant and move farther through the labyrinth. This is one reason the Yucatan submerged caves are so remarkable to biologists. They hold not just isolated organisms, but patterns of isolation and exchange playing out in darkness. The chamber narrows through a stone gate, two rounded pillars left standing where dissolution widened the tunnel on either side. You pass between them and enter a straighter corridor with a long downward view. The floor is faintly rippled, not by waves, by slow sorting. The ripples are broad and low, made of fine carbonate sediment and the smallest organic remnants that have found rest here. Each crest is only slightly different from the trough beside it, but the repetition gives the bottom a gentle order. On the sheltered side of one ripple, there is a thread-like white growth trailing from the stone. On the exposed side, none. This is enough to tell you where the subtle movement runs. Even in stillness, the cave has orientation. A little farther on, the left wall opens into a shallow recess. Inside it, the rock is lined with miniature draperies of calcite, thin folds descended from an age when this space breathed air. Now they are submerged, their edges blunted, but the folds remain distinct. The recess is like a small preserved sentence from the dry cave world. It reminds you that every part of this hidden network has changed more than once. Dry, then damp, air-filled, then flooded. Fresh water, then mixed, then settled again into new gradients. The Yucatan limestone does not keep one stable condition forever. It keeps the record of changes. Those changes can be read in minerals the way tree rings can be read in wood. A dripstone band may indicate wetter or drier periods. A submerged line may indicate where water chemistry paused at one level for centuries. An eroded edge may show later submergence. Because the cave changes slowly, these records endure. And because they endure, They turn the aquifer into an archive of climate as much as a reservoir of water. This is another quiet stake of the cenote system. It does not only hold life in the present, it remembers rainfall, sea level, and environmental shifts across the peninsula in forms patient enough to survive. You continue downward. The corridor bends, and with the bend comes a low, silvery haze close to the floor. At first it seems like stirred sediment lingering there, but the water above it remains almost perfectly clear. Then the pattern resolves. The haze is a suspended veil, very thin, lying over a darker band of bottom, where chemistry differs enough to keep the finest particles from behaving as they do elsewhere. You do not move into it yet. You hold above and watch. Nothing obvious happens. No plume rises, no animals scatter. But the veil maintains its shape, which means the water near the floor is layered more delicately than it first appeared. These are the kinds of places where dissolved oxygen, salinity, and reduced compounds can set up narrow ecological opportunities, not broad habitats. Fine margins. And margins, in caves, are often where the most specialized communities gather. A tiny isopod crosses the edge of the haze and vanishes into the darker zone beneath a rock lip. That small movement confirms what the eye already suspected. The floor here is not empty, only chemically detailed. A little shelf beside the haze carries a patch of pale biofilm, smooth as wax. It catches the least available light and returns it with a soft dullness that makes it visible. Microbial life is doing much of the quiet work again, breaking down what little organic matter reaches this route, using dissolved compounds where it can, creating surfaces that small grazers can exploit. If a larger animal survives this far into the network, it does so partly because these thin, invisible communities continue the slow labor of turning chemistry into habitability. You lower yourself past the haze, and the passage opens unexpectedly into a broader hall. Not tall, not dramatic, just wide enough that the walls recede and the sense of direction becomes momentarily less certain. This hall feels less used by through flow than the conduit behind it. More silt rests on the floor. The walls carry fewer crisp signs of sorting. In a way, it feels like a shoulder off the main artery, a place where water pauses longer, a quiet pocket in the network. Because the flow is weaker here, the sediments are richer in detail. There are smooth aprons of pale mud, darker islands of organic-rich material, and small crescents where settling particles have gathered against breakdown blocks fallen long ago from the ceiling. Each block is half buried, softened by mineral films, no longer sharp enough to seem recent. This hole may have been shaped by collapse first, then absorbed into a larger groundwater route later. In karst, origins overlap. A collapse chamber can become a settling basin. A conduit can lose its flow and become a storehouse for fine sediment. A dry room with dripstone can later become part of a layered aquifer. No single label holds for long. Near the center of the hall, the floor darkens in a broad, irregular patch. You approach carefully, and the patch resolves into a field of microbial mats spread across the silt like weather on a plain. Some areas are smooth and pale, others are smoky gray with feathered edges. In one section there is the faintest bluish karst, not bright, only enough to suggest that different communities are occupying neighboring zones according to chemistry, too subtle for the eye to measure directly. This is another deep garden, not as concentrated as the basin behind you, but broader. And because the hall is more connected to the aquifer, the patterns seem less isolated and more stretched, as if the chemistry itself is being gently drawn in one direction. You float above the mats and let your attention settle. At first, there is almost no movement. Then a translucent amphipod flickers from one edge to another. A shrimp follows a line where pale mat meets bare silt. Farther off, a fish, nearly without color, hangs beneath a projecting slab. These few visible animals feel less like the main inhabitants than the most noticeable visitors. The real body of life is the film, the veil, the mat, the bacterial thread. Down here, Large presence gives way to distributed presence. That change has been building for some time, and now it is complete enough to feel unmistakable. The farther the cave extends from sunlight and falling forest debris, the more the ecosystem depends on subtle, low energy pathways. Chemosynthetic microbes do not replace every other source of food in a cenote system. Surface-derived organic matter still matters. Drifting detritus still matters. Bats, roots, and seepage still matter where they can reach. But in these deep holes and side basins, microbial communities become disproportionately important because they can make use of local chemistry even when more obvious resources are sparse. That is why these cenote depths can resemble a quiet model of much older biological worlds. Not because they are primitive in any simple sense, but because they show how life can remain viable in darkness through persistence, gradient, and chemical opportunity. A small ridge of sediment rises from the mat field toward the far wall. Along its crest lie several leaf-shaped stains, mineral dark and delicate, as though organic fragments once rested there and slowly dissolved into the floor. Perhaps they did. Leaves can sink through cenotes from the opening above, or arrive in broken form through connected routes after rains carry fine debris into cracks and sink points. Most such material decays long before traveling far. Only a little reaches the deeper system, but a little, repeated over years, is enough to leave traces and sustain life. This is another lesson of the cave. Scarcity does not mean absence. It means each arrival matters more. You pass over the ridge and approach the wall. There, a series of small horizontal notches marks former levels where water chemistry lingered against the limestone. A thin white calcite lip edges each notch. Above them, the stone is smoother and paler. Below, darker and more film-coated. These bands imply long intervals when the hall held slightly different layering than it does now. Perhaps sea level stood differently. Perhaps recharge from inland was stronger or weaker. Perhaps a neighboring collapse altered circulation enough to shift the balance. Whatever the exact cause, the wall records consequence. That is what makes the aquifer feel so thoughtful. It does not react in surface bursts. It integrates. It adjusts over long spans, then leaves a readable memory. You angle away from the wall, and the hall narrows into a passage with a firmer floor. Again, the system is guiding you onward, from pause to route, from settling space to connection. The passage is low and nearly symmetrical, a long ellipse of rock where groundwater once had a clearer path. Because the walls are closer here, you can see the mineral changes more intimately. Fine crystals line some seams. Elsewhere, the stone has been eaten into tiny cups. In one pocket, a milky coating suggests mineral precipitation encouraged by seepage. In another, a rusty brown stain hints at iron compounds moving in trace amounts through the limestone and changing when they meet different conditions. Even in a carbonate landscape, other elements leave their signatures. Nothing underground is chemically pure for long. The aquifer is always carrying a dissolved conversation. The temperature falls another small degree. It is not enough to become uncomfortable. It is enough to deepen the sensation of insulated water, water less touched by daily heat from the jungle above. This older feeling is not an illusion. Some groundwater in karst systems can spend a very long time below before emerging again. Residence times vary by route. Some water moves relatively quickly through conduits after heavy rain. Some lingers in pores and fractures, mixing slowly, exchanging minerals, being replaced only by degrees. In a layered system like this, water at depth may have been traveling or resting underground for spans long enough that weather at the surface feels distant, translated, softened. That is why the passage feels so separate from dawn now. Morning still exists above the forest, but down here, time is measured more by seepage and settlement than by sunlight. The passage bends left. At the bend there is a little field of fallen calcite fragments half buried in silt. Each piece is pale and rounded, broken from older formations somewhere upslope in the cave's history. Nothing has carried them far. They lie where they came to rest, as if set aside for later by a hand made of gravity. This is one of the more peaceful qualities of cenote depth. Objects remain, not forever perhaps, but for spans long enough that stillness becomes part of their identity. You pass the fragment field and enter another chamber, smaller than the last hall, but deeper in mood. The floor drops toward the center in a shallow bowl. At the bowl's edge, a faint horizontal shimmer crosses the water, not as strong as the earlier Halocline, more subtle. A secondary layering, perhaps, where slightly different salinities or temperatures are meeting in a narrower range. The Yucatan aquifer is full of such complexity. People often imagine one freshwater layer over one saltwater layer. In truth, the meeting can be graduated, folded by topography, adjusted by seasons, and complicated by local conduits that carry waters with different histories. This bowl seems to hold one of those refinements, not a major frontier, a quiet, internal boundary. You do not need to disturb it to understand it. The shimmer alone tells you enough. The chamber has become chemically stratified. Below the shimmer, the bowl floor is darker. Cloudy bacterial films lie in low patches there, and the sediment between them is almost black-grey in places, suggesting reduced conditions near the bottom. Low oxygen can develop where organic matter breaks down and water exchange is weak enough for the result to remain. In such places, sulfur cycling and other microbial processes may become important. The smell cannot reach you here in the usual surface sense, but the visual clues are enough. This is a chemically rich silence. A pale root descends from a crack in the ceiling and stops well above the floor. Its lower half is coated in mineral crust. The root once sought water, now it has become part of the geology of the chamber. That transformation is deeply cenote-like. The living forest leans down into the hidden aquifer, and over years the cave translates those intrusions into stone memory. Roots become calcified threads. Falling leaves become stains. Organic inputs become microbial bloom and then sediment. The surface and the subterranean do not remain separate. They exchange, slowly. You cross the bowl without touching the lower layer and rise gently toward the far side, where the chamber opens again. As you leave, the visible life changes once more. The fish are rarer now. The crustaceans appear only in intervals, often near cracks or mineral seams, where enough food or oxygen gathers to justify the wait. The ecosystem is thinning but not disappearing. It is becoming more selective. That selectivity gives each observation more weight. A shrimp on a ledge is no longer just one animal. It is evidence that this ledge offers something worth returning to. A microbial veil is no longer just a film. It is a sign that chemistry is active enough here to sustain organized life. The passage beyond the bowl angles gently upward for a short distance, then levels. That rise is important. In a cave network, a small topographic high can separate water bodies with slightly different conditions, trapping denser layers below or changing how particles travel. As you pass over the rise, the floor becomes cleaner again, and the walls show stronger signs of through flow. This is another artery. The aquifer keeps alternately revealing and concealing itself through these transitions. A still hall, a connected corridor, a bowl with local stratification, a rise, a new conduit. Step by step, you are learning not one chamber, but a buried geography. That geography extends far beyond the reach of this descent. There are other cenotes above, many of them only small dark openings in the forest floor, or vine-ringed pools, or collapsed wells hidden among limestone and leaf litter. Some connect into major systems. Some end sooner, some hold stronger freshwater influence, some reach deep into the saline underlayer, some chambers preserve extraordinary dry-age formations. Others are dominated by modern sediment and microbial activity. Together they form one of the most extensive submerged karst landscapes on Earth. And yet from above, the land can seem quiet, level, almost simple. That contrast is part of the wonder. An ordinary-looking forest can stand above an immense hidden architecture. You move farther along the conduit. The walls are smoother here, and the floor has a narrow central groove. Again, no obvious current passes your body. But the groove could not form without repeated transport, however slight. Particles have been guided along this route. Fine material has been kept from accumulating at the center. The cave is telling you very gently where the water prefers to move. At intervals, side cracks open and close along the right wall. From some, tiny threads of white microbial growth extend like submerged silk. From others, nothing visible emerges at all. That difference may reflect chemistry. One crack may leak water rich in reduced compounds, another may carry little more than clear recharge, a third may be inactive now but have mattered in another season or another century. The hidden system never presents itself all at once. It reveals only what is active enough, persistent enough, and stable enough to leave a trace in the present moment. You continue, because there is no sense of ending here. The deeper system does not narrow toward a single point. Instead, it branches, divides, rejoins, and slips away through limestone in directions you can only infer by temperature, texture, and the behavior of the floor. And because it branches, the life within it also distributes itself in quiet fragments, each chamber carrying a slightly different version of endurance. Ahead, the conduit widens just enough for the water to feel less guided by the walls. The floor softens again. Sediment gathers in long, dim tongues, and the central groove relaxes into a shallow plain. This change has a consequence almost at once. Where flow weakens, the bottom holds more traces. There are thin lines left by tiny bodies crossing silt. There are crescents of darker material pooled behind small rises in the stone. There are pale films, so smooth they look painted on, occupying the sheltered margins where chemistry can remain stable for a long time. You drift lower, not to settle, only to read the floor more clearly. In one narrow pocket, there is a cluster of almost transparent crustaceans, each no more than a small moving thread with legs. They remain close to the rock. That is not caution in the dramatic sense. It is simply good design for a place where food tends to gather at boundaries, not in open water. A cave wall is never just a wall. It leaks, catches, shelters, and records. A seam in the limestone may release water with a different mineral load. A ledge may hold organic dust that would never remain on an exposed floor. A crack may protect a shrimp from the slow passing of a pale fish that feeds by feeling rather than by seeing. Every surface matters more here because there are fewer wasted surfaces. As you follow the plane forward, the tunnel overhead lowers and flattens. The shape becomes almost tubular, as though ancient groundwater preferred this exact route for a very long span. In karst landscapes, favored pathways widen gradually. Water that finds a weakness tends to keep using it. The rock dissolves a little more along the same line. The opening grows. More water follows. The route becomes a conduit, then a corridor, then part of a larger underground anatomy. That long preference is written all around you now. The ceiling is smooth in broad arcs. The side walls carry rounded pockets instead of sharp fractures. The floor, though dusted with sediment, still shows the muted polish of repeated contact with moving water over immense time. And then another sign appears. At first it is only a slight deepening of color along the left wall, a dim horizontal band where the limestone turns from pale cream to soft brown gray. Then, below that, a second band, darker still. These are not decorations, they are water memories. Different mixtures have occupied this corridor for long intervals. Freshwater richer in oxygen at one level, more saline or more chemically reduced water lower down. Perhaps not always exactly where they sit now, but near enough, long enough, to leave the walls stratified in tone and texture. You pause beside the bands and let your eyes move from one layer to the next. The upper rock carries a finer calcite sheen. The lower band supports more film. The transition is feathered rather than abrupt. That softness tells you the boundary shifted over time. Season to season, age to age, recharge stronger in some periods, marine pressure more pronounced in others. The hidden aquifer has never been motionless in the absolute sense. It has only moved so slowly that motion became history. A little farther on, a root enters from the ceiling through a hairline crack. It is thin, dark at the top, pale below where minerals have coated it. The root does not reach the floor. It hangs in the water like a sentence unfinished. Somewhere above, a tree once sent this thread downward in search of moisture. Perhaps the tree is gone now. Perhaps the root is no longer alive. But the cave has kept the gesture. That is one of the strange tendernesses of cenotes. The forest extends itself into the aquifer, and the aquifer answers by preserving fragments of the reach. When you move past the root, the water ahead takes on another faint shimmer, not the broad, wavering blur of the first Halocline. This one is lower, tighter, and harder to detect. It lies close over the floor, following the shape of a depression that stretches down the center of the passage. The depression is only a little deeper than the stone around it, but that is enough. Denser water can gather in such places. Oxygen-poorer water can linger. Fine suspended material can hover in a layer too stable to disperse quickly. The effect is subtle, but once seen, it cannot be unseen. The cave is layered not only from chamber to chamber, but within chambers, within bowls, within channels no deeper than a handspan. That detail changes how you understand the creatures here. A shrimp crossing the floor is not moving through one uniform environment. It may be passing from slightly fresher water into slightly saltier water, from higher oxygen into lower oxygen, from bare sediment into a microbial zone, all within a few body lengths. Its smallness is not a disadvantage. It is a way of living precisely inside gradients. You follow the center depression where the shimmer rests, and the passage begins a long, slow descent. The slope is gentle enough that you almost notice it only after several moments. But the walls confirm it. Mineral bands rise behind you, the floor darkens ahead, the water cools again by the slightest degree. All of it says the same thing. You are moving into a reach of the system that rests more deeply within the peninsula's buried freshwater and marine exchange. The life grows sparser here. You do not need anyone to announce that. The evidence is simple. There are fewer moving bodies. Tracks in the sediment are older and less overlapped. The walls carry more chemical films and fewer signs of fresh organic debris arriving from above. This does not mean the corridor is empty. It means the ecosystem is thinning toward its most stable essentials. At the lip of a low ledge, a blind fish hovers with its head angled toward a narrow fissure. Its body is pale as diluted milk. Its eyes are present, but reduced. Its fins make such small corrections that the water around it seems stiller for their restraint. You pass slowly, and the fish remains where it is. Perhaps the fissure exhales faintly cooler water. Perhaps it carries a trace of dissolved compounds that hint at prey or oxygen. Whatever the reason, the fish has chosen this place with care. In cave systems, choice is often about tiny returns. A little better chemistry, a little more shelter, a little more food caught where flow turns. Over generations, such choices become distribution. Distribution becomes isolation. Isolation becomes difference. That is how a network of passages under one peninsula can hold related creatures that are not exactly the same from one branch to another. The rock itself helps decide their futures. A collapse blocks one route, a rise in the floor traps denser water below. A narrow connection remains open between two chambers while another closes with sediment. Each geological detail alters who can move, who remains separated, and what traits become useful in that local darkness. You continue downward, and the conduit opens into a chamber with a floor so level it feels almost artificial. But it is not made. It is settled. Fine sediment has accumulated in a broad sheet across the bottom, interrupted only by a few low mounds of older breakdown rock buried to their shoulders. The chamber is quiet in a new way, not the active quiet of a passage carrying subtle exchange, a heavier quiet, a place where more particles can come to rest and where water may spend longer in place before being nudged onward through cracks too small to see. You know this matters because the floor is marked not by grooves, but by layers. There are pale upper deposits and darker bands beneath them, where the sediment has been disturbed only by the slow work of chemistry. A chamber like this is a trap for time. What falls in may remain, what drifts through may settle. A little organic matter arriving from distant roots may become part of the floor for centuries. Tiny shifts in water chemistry may leave thin differences in color, each one recording a period of slightly altered conditions. The cave bottom becomes a stack of quiet intervals. Near the center of the chamber, the sediment changes from soft cream to gray-brown, then darker still. These darker reaches are not random stains. They often suggest greater organic accumulation, lower oxygen, or stronger microbial processing near the sediment-water boundary. At first glance, the chamber might seem less alive than the passages above, but if you wait, patterns emerge. There is a faint milky film stretched over one dark patch. There are thread-like growths along the edge of another. A slow-moving isopod crosses the pale margin and disappears into the grey. This is life distributed as surface texture. Not spectacle, not motion. Presence, the deeper YUCATAN Cenote systems often reach this point in your attention. Large forms recede, processes come forward. You stop asking what animal will appear next and begin asking what the floor is doing, what the walls are releasing, what the water layers are permitting. That shift is one of the clearest signs that you have gone far enough for the cave to set the pace. At the far side of the chamber, the floor rises slightly to a shelf of exposed limestone. The shelf is lined with calcite crusts, white in places, amber in others. Some look smooth, some are nodular, as though minerals precipitated there in stages as seepage emerged, paused, and altered under the surrounding water. Those crusts matter because they show that even here, where the chamber seems still, exchange continues. Water enters through stone at scales too small for the eye. It brings dissolved calcium carbonate and other ions. Conditions shift. Crystals form, a thin skin develops, years pass. The skin thickens, the chamber writes its chemistry into stone. You drift over the shelf and discover a low opening behind it, almost hidden by the angle of the floor. This is the decision the cave offers now. Remain in the settling room, where the sediment keeps its layered archive, or follow the lower route, where the water feels colder and the walls are more tightly drawn. You choose the lower route because the hidden system keeps indicating that depth here is not simply downward, it is inward, towards stronger insulation, older water, and thinner signs of the surface. At once, the chamber behind you broadens in memory and then fades. The slot ahead is narrow enough that the walls nearly meet your shoulders, though still without pressure or urgency. The limestone is smooth, with long shallow scallops cut into both sides. This passage was not made by collapse. It was used. Repeated groundwater flow favored it for a long time. And because it was used, it connects something important to something else. The slot descends gently, then straightens. The floor is almost bare. Only here and there does a pocket of silt collect in a tiny hollow. In those hollows are fine branching tracks, delicate as writing in dust. Small crustaceans have passed recently enough to leave them visible. Their roots seem purposeful, from one crack to another, from a wall seam to a sheltered pocket, from chemistry to chemistry. That is how movement works this deep in the system. Not wandering, following slight advantages. The slot opens suddenly into a long chamber, deeper than it is wide, with a floor of dark silt and a ceiling lost in dimness. The walls are more vertical here. There are fewer hanging forms, less evidence of grand, dry-age dripstone, more evidence of water standing, layering, and exchanging quietly over long periods. This chamber feels less like a fossil room and more like part of the present aquifer, a living basin. The floor is darker than anything above, not black exactly. A charcoal grey softened by silt and faint pale films laid across it like thin cloud. Near one wall, bacterial mats gather in overlapping patches. Some are creamy and opaque, Others are almost transparent, visible mainly by the way they dull the sediment beneath. A few carry a slight iridescent cast, not bright enough to glow, but enough to suggest thickness and difference. Such mats often form where oxygen is scarce near the bottom, and reduced compounds rise from sediment or seep in from deeper roots. The organisms living there are not using sunlight. They are using opportunity, and opportunity in this chamber arrives as chemistry held stable by depth. You stay high enough not to disturb the floor. That matters now more than ever. A single careless touch could send a cloud of fine material into the chamber, hiding the structures that have taken years to settle into place. The undisturbed water lets you see just how organized the basin is. The mats do not spread evenly. They occupy zones, low areas where darker sediment gathers, margins where a slight rise changes oxygen exposure, a narrow line along the wall where seepage appears to enter. This is a landscape, not a stain. A small shrimp glides over one mat, pauses, and lifts away. Its body is almost invisible until it crosses darker ground. That crossing reveals something important. The mat's surface is not just chemistry, it is habitat. For minute grazers, for scavengers, for animals reading the difference between living film and bare silt. The chamber may seem austere, but it is not simple. Complexity has only moved to a finer scale. As you watch, a few particles descend from above. They fall so slowly that they hardly seem to fall at all. Perhaps they are mineral grains from a distant seam. Perhaps bits of organic dust that entered the aquifer far away and traveled here over a long, uncertain route. Whatever they are, their arrival matters because input is so slight. The deep cenote does not receive abundance. It receives fragments. Yet fragments, accumulated over years, become food, sediment, and chemical change. That is how the bottom of a hidden basin can remain inhabited. The walls of the chamber bear another kind of evidence. At mid-height, there is a pale mineral line that runs almost level around the room. Below it, the rock is darker and more film-coated. Above it, cleaner, lighter, more calcite-bright. This looks like a former standing boundary in the water column. Perhaps the chamber held a stronger, more stable layer there for a long time. Perhaps a shift in recharge or marine pressure has since altered the level. Whatever the cause, the chamber remembers it. Even here, where change feels almost absent, the system has adjusted enough across the years to leave a visible band. You move along the line for a while, tracing it from one wall to the next. In places, it breaks around solution pockets. In others, it rides over mineral crusts that must have formed later. This tells you the order is layered. First, one water condition persisted. Then minerals precipitated over parts of it. Then newer films gathered below. The cave is building history in overlapping strokes. And because no storm surge reaches this far, because no surface wave rearranges the evidence, those strokes remain legible. The floor deepens toward the center of the chamber in a broad, shallow bowl. There, the water above the sediment looks slightly denser, though the effect is visual more than tactile. A low haze lies over the bowl, no more than a handspan thick. This is another chemically distinct near-bottom layer where reduced conditions may be stronger and where microbial metabolism likely differs from the water above. The bowl is the quiet heart of the chamber. You do not descend into it. You let it remain undisturbed and read it from above. That choice has its own reward. From this distance, the structure of the basin becomes clearer. The darker central sediment, the pale marginal films, the line of seep-fed growth along the left wall, the faint tracks converging on the bowl's edge but not crossing its deepest center. Animals are respecting the same gradients you are noticing. They are using the margins where conditions are just right. Below the chamber, another route clearly continues. It does not announce itself with an open tunnel. It appears first as a narrowing of the bowl, where the floor tips gently into a darker throat. That shape is enough. Sediment thins there. The near-bottom haze follows the contour. A subtle coolness touches the water moving upward from below. All of it says the chamber is not terminal. It is another resting place in a larger chain. This is the quiet reveal that has been building since the upper cenote shaft. You did not descend into a single hidden pool. You entered a buried watershed. A limestone circulatory system extending under much of the peninsula, storing rain, admitting marine influence, separating species, preserving evidence, and carrying water between places the surface never joined so obviously. That scale does not make the chamber feel less intimate. It makes intimacy feel larger. A root from the forest above can end in this water. A grain of carbonate dust can settle on this floor. A drop of rain can enter far inland, and after enough time, alter the chemistry of this very bowl. Everything remains local and connected at once. You follow the darker throat because the cave keeps opening farther than expected. The throat is lower than the chamber and shaped like a dissolved trench, rounded at the edges and free of loose breakdown. Again, this suggests long use by water. As you descend through it, the wall texture changes. There is less bright calcite, more dull mineral skin. The water cools another small degree. This is not a dramatic threshold, but the consequence is clear. You are entering a more insulated portion of the network, where the traces of rainfall and roots arrive only after long translation through stone. The trench carries you into a corridor with a floor of alternating firm limestone and pockets of dark mud. The mud pockets are bordered by tiny white bacterial threads, each one anchored where conditions suit it. In one pocket, a pale amphipod darts, then stops under a ledge. In another, there is no visible animal at all, only the film and the waiting sediment. A deep cave corridor teaches you to accept that not every useful place must be visibly occupied in the moment. Habitats can be present even when the inhabitants are hidden in cracks, resting in mud, or moving only at intervals too slow to catch at once. The corridor curves left, then right. Its bends are smooth and conduit-like. This was once a preferred route and perhaps still is, for enough groundwater movement to keep the shape coherent. At each bend, the sediment sorts itself differently. Heavier grains settle in the inside pockets. Finer material spreads thinly along the outer floor. These patterns are gentle, but they are unmistakable signs of passage. The aquifer is always carrying, always arranging, always making choices through physics too soft to hear. Up ahead, the corridor begins to broaden. Not into a room exactly, more into a lower, wider reach where the walls retreat and the floor disappears into a plain of silt. The water there is darker, calmer, and visually older somehow, as if fewer disturbances have passed through in recent memory. The transition is immediate in feeling. The corridor had direction. The plain has rest. That rest is important because deep cenote systems often gather into such basins where the finest sediments can settle over extraordinary spans. Each grain falls through still water. Each layer records another interval of quiet. If the upper chambers were archives of air and changing sea level, and the middle reaches archives of layered chemistry and microbial adaptation, then these lower planes begin to feel like archives of duration itself. You move into the widening reach and see the bottom spread away beneath you. The sediment is incredibly fine. It lies in pale drifts where no current reaches strongly enough to rearrange it often. Here and there, darker streaks interrupt the pale floor, likely organic rich deposits or more active microbial zones. There are no tall formations, no dramatic stalactites, only low mineral rises, buried breakdown blocks, and a levelness that feels almost endless in the dim water. Visible life is reduced to the smallest signs. A single shrimp crossing a shadowed margin, a tiny isopod on the side of a half-buried rock,